This is TWiT. Netflix took a big hit this week. You probably heard all about it the last couple of days especially. Their first loss in net subscribers in 10 years, perhaps ever. I mean, they've constantly been on this upward trajectory. They are now facing a lot of competition, of course. They've got issues. They're battling with their subscribers about password sharing, which at one point Reed Hastings talked, I wouldn't say favorably, but he kind of accepted at one point, like, oh yeah, it's going to happen. Now suddenly they're realizing the heat is on, and so those rules are changing. Joining us to talk about these muddy waters that are really surrounding Netflix right now, and as well its content strategy, is Alyssa Rosenberg, who wrote an opinion piece for the Washington Post saying that this Netflix come down is a relief. Welcome, Alyssa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to get you on. Thank you so much for hopping on today. So let's start with a headline, because that's the easy thing to start with, and it's certainly what grabbed my attention. You said that this is a relief. Who might this Netflix downturn actually benefit? I guess explain that thesis around that.
Sure. I confess to being a little puckish there. Obviously, the huge content spree that Netflix has fueled has been fantastic for anyone who creates pop culture. And I don't want to diminish the experience of writers and showrunners and directors who are looking at this and thinking, hey, maybe the gravy train is, sort of closing up shop for the decade. Yeah. But I think that the content boom that Netflix has inspired has been exhausting and to a certain extent culturally atomizing. And I say this as someone who used to think that a huge proliferation of content might actually end the culture wars. If everyone got a little bit of what they wanted, maybe they wouldn't be so stressed about what everyone else was getting. If everyone was represented, maybe you didn't need to be as stressed out. But it's become clear that we're all, binging away in our own little silos, and, we don't have anyone to talk about the culture we love with anymore. I mean, if you look at the Google search trends for Netflix shows, they have incredibly sharp peaks and they just disappear from the cultural conversation. If you look at something like Game of Thrones or, Mad Men, any of the shows that aired weekly during the so-called golden age of television, you would get sort of extended conversations and, more sort of plateaus than, the Alps in terms of search interest. And so there was a real vibrant conversation and community around pop culture that Netflix has really sort of helped to dissipate in a way that I think has been, if not, I don't want to blame it for the culture wars, but certainly I think it's made television much less of a collective experience in a way that I really miss, and that I think a lot of people find more lonely than they used to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Netflix really, leaned in heavily into we're giving you, these top-notch shows, but we're giving it all to you at once so you can binge on it, which ultimately, at the end of the day, that gives the viewer the instant gratification, but does nothing to really kind of build up the hype on a elongated scale. I mean, Squid Game saw a lot of hype and attention for a while, but maybe part of that was because it was kind of obscure to begin with for the mainstream U.S. audience, and then once that kind of ball started rolling, that extended for, I feel like, a couple of months. But you look at what HBO has done forever and what they're still doing with their digital offerings. Euphoria, you're still getting that on a weekly basis, and that keeps people talking about it for months and months.
Yeah, and I also think it has an impact on how the people who are making serialized storytelling in particular structure those stories, right? Oh, yeah. I mean, if you need to, it's a very different thing to make, people joke about TV series being 10-hour movies, but it's very different in terms of how you pace the story if you're making something that you think people are going to watch in 1 or 2 sittings versus something that, they're going to chew over for a week before watching the next installment. I mean, cliffhangers are good. Suspense is good. Having people feel anxious and excited for the next installment of your story is actually a good thing. In terms of engaging with it, in terms of forcing you to pace it and sort of parcel out your story in a way that is actually sort of structurally and narratively sustaining. So I don't love the binge watch as a social phenomenon because, look, we live in a culture where people are incredibly spoiler-averse. I'm not personally, but that's just me. And if you have no idea where anyone else is in a piece of serialized television, you can't talk to them about it, right? And by the time that, the person you love to talk to TV about has caught up with your latest obsession, you may be onto something else. You mentioned Squid Game, but also when was the last time you heard someone talking about a plot point from Squid Game?
Yeah.
Or looking forward to, it's here and it's gone. And Netflix, in turning the fire hose on viewers, it's sort of evaporated our common cultural moments.
Yeah, indeed. Is there such a thing as having too much content available? Because I feel like that's where we're at right now. It really seems like, everybody has a streaming service, and every streaming service has to be fueled by, yes, content that you're used to seeing, say, on the network, but also original content, which is, as you said earlier, great for creators. People in the industry they're busier than they've probably ever been right now. But as a viewer, it makes it really hard to attach to anything because there's always another thing.
Absolutely. It's not just that there aren't sustained conversations, but we all have only so many hours in the day, right? There are a limited number of people in the world. They have a limited number of hours. A limited number of those hours are for leisure time. At a certain point, you're going to produce more television than can actually be watched by large groups of people. John Landgraf, who runs the FX network and is, sort of a public intellectual of television, has coined this term that he called peak TV to describe just the sheer number of scripted shows that were being produced. And, when you have north of 500 scripted shows being produced each year, the vast majority of those, look, TV shows always fail, right? That's the reason there was a pilot season in traditional network television. You put stuff out there, some of it doesn't work. But now you're creating all of this stuff, which is wonderful, but a lot of it is just never going to get a chance to find its audience because there is so much of it. We're all living in a constant state of FOMO about TV, and there's the sense that there's always something better out there. And I think it's hard for people to even know where to start. It's overwhelming. And I think, look, it's great for creators from sort of a monetary perspective. It's important to be able to get to work. It's nice to have a job. But at the end of the day, people still tell stories because they want other people to listen to them.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
If people can't find your show, if people can't find your movie, if people can't concentrate on your show or movie because the next shiny thing is always around the corner, it's not just all about the money. That's something that's, I think, really crucial that's missing from the experience.
Yeah, indeed. And there is some news today that really, in my mind, and actually, Mikah, you're going to talk about this in detail a little bit later, so I don't want to spoil too much, but that CNN Plus, the streaming service, is ending at the end of the month. I think that's slightly more than a month that it's lasted for. Would you agree? Is that casualty related to kind of what you're talking about in any way here, or is that different?
I think that's a little bit different. CNN is trying to create a bridge to a new generation of viewers who aren't necessarily tuning into linear cable. They're trying to sort of reach them where they were at, but while there is obviously an existing demand for good scripted television, I'm not sure what the existing audience was for CNN, but not really breaking news, but streamed. And so I think to a certain extent that is it's a different product offering. It's an attempt to solve a different problem. And to a certain extent, you have to give CNN credit for deciding, it didn't work. They weren't going to stick around with it forever.
Sure.
And sort of moving on to the next thing. So I think it's a complicated landscape, but I think that's slightly different. Yeah,
I think the correlation that I might draw between them is just the overabundance of these services where we're at right now, right? Like every single network, every single studio feels like at this point, in order to stay relevant and stay current, they have to have their own streaming service. But again, we as subscribers, we end up feeling overwhelmed by the amount of subscriptions that we can do. And it's just, there's too much. It's so much to manage that, of course, there's going to be casualties along the way. There's also the fact that, I think a lot of people, because there's so much opportunity or so many options, people don't necessarily feel like they have to subscribe to a Netflix for an entire year, let's say. It might be something where they can subscribe for a month. And because Netflix does the binge approach, everything they need is there immediately. There's no reason for them to stretch it out for a couple of months in order to get it.
Exactly. Watch Bridgerton 1 month, then hop over to Apple TV for Ted Lasso. I think the point that you're making about CNN Plus that I do think is interesting is there was this sense early in the streaming era that people were going to be able to cut the cord, pay just for the services that they wanted, and that it was going to be really easy to assemble your own streamlined bundle. Well, guess what? The cable bundle was actually a pretty good deal. You got, original stuff on the networks. You could pay up for a premium network like HBO or Showtime, but you were getting all of your sports and your news thrown in there. And reassembling that bundle is not just expensive, but it's sort of emotionally tedious, picking through all of the different services and trying to come up with the perfect budget-conscious package. Unbundling was the dream, but I'm not sure that it's proved to be a vibrant reality.
Yeah. And I guess along these lines, Netflix has done so well for so long. Now we're starting to kind of see a few cracks in the foundation as far as competition is concerned. What does, in your mind, kind of Netflix's current position, what does that say for other streaming services like the HBO service and Disney Plus, or is this completely separate? This is just Netflix finally realizing, hey, we're not the only ones in town doing this sort of thing.
Well, look, I think HBO reported some subscriber gains today. So what Netflix is kind of doing is defining the ceiling for everyone in the business, right? The question has always been, how many potential subscribers are there to any group of services? Jason Killer, who was at HBO, was saying it could be as high as 1 billion. Netflix, I think, has pegged the number more at 500 million. And that's international. But those numbers are challenging to reach. Netflix hasn't really cracked the code in India. No streaming services are licensed to operate in China. So right now, Netflix is kind of defining the ceiling for the streaming business. And, places like Disney Plus, which has, and HBO, which have fantastic content libraries, perhaps haven't reached their personal ceilings yet. But I think that, there are just a lot of questions about what the value proposition is here and what content spending the pool of subscribers can support, right? Netflix has spent an insane amount of money on content. I saw someone, I think it was maybe Lucas Shaw at Bloomberg, saying that Netflix's market cap is starting to sort of even out around the amount of money that they've spent on programming. And, you can't have a system where your subscriber growth and the content spending that drive it both increase forever. They're going to level off at some point. And so what we're seeing is that the size of the market is getting defined, and that will shake out to suggest the amount of content that can be produced. If you're Disney Plus or HBO, you're seeing strong subscriber numbers with a less frenetic pace of content, but stuff that's a little bit more carefully chosen. I don't love all of the original series that Disney Plus is putting out. I'm a little burned out on Marvel, and as a huge Star Wars nerd, I am deeply disappointed by the Disney era of Lucasfilm. But they are able to pull in those subscriber numbers with a more selective selection of content. And that, maybe it's encouraging for them to see, okay, the amount of stuff that you need to keep a service afloat isn't, it's a question of quality, not quantity. And I think, Netflix was trying to replace a licensed library from someplace else. But those back library items do really matter. The Disney catalog is unbeatable if you're a parent. The HBO back catalog is pretty unbeatable if you love classic television and, the Warner Brothers movie library. And so, Netflix has not created a lot of stone cold classics to fill up its own library with. But at least you can see Bright 2 starring Will Smith as a cop with an orc partner.
Well, I love how you put it in your piece too. I felt very seen when you had the part about laundry folding accompaniment, about the content on Netflix, often being an accompaniment to the chores that we do, which just basically made me realize, hey, our family is not alone. Like, oh, hey, we're not the only ones doing that. But also like how the platform feels about, its content being essentially something that viewers don't mind distracting themselves with while they do menial tasks. You know what I mean? What does that say about your content strategy? I don't know. Probably every platform has some content like that, but Netflix seems to have a lot of content like that. And
I think, our historical memories are a little bit short. Like television used to be the point of network television used to be to sell soap, right? It was sort of meant to be a distraction, which is not to say that it wasn't high quality, but it wasn't necessarily meant to be a high art gem. That's a relatively newer idea in the history of television. And I also want to be fair to Netflix. Like, Bridgerton is my jam, even if I'm a little frustrated by the second season. Someone who read Julia Quinn's novels back in the day. There is stuff on Netflix that I really like. They put out, they distribute movies that I think, would have a hard time finding distributorship elsewhere. They've kind of kept romantic comedy as a genre afloat. But when you have that much stuff in the pipeline, some of it's going to be misses. It's actually really hard to make good content and to make it at scale. And it's not necessarily Netflix's fault that they haven't, created an immortal back catalog in 10 years of making original content.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Well, this is great stuff. Thank you so much for hopping on today to talk with us about Netflix, Alyssa Rosenberg. Really appreciate your time. Of course, you write for the Washington Post, WashingtonPost.com. If people want to find and follow you online, where can they do so?
It's pretty easy. It's just Alyssa Rosenberg on Twitter. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. That makes too much sense. All right. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.